For as long as the film industry has existed, this genre has been playing on our movie screens. But what really constitutes a good war film and what makes a bad one? Well, today we're here to find out. On this week's episode of Two Please, a podcast meant for all things pop culture and entertainment, we're doing exactly that, tackling what makes a good war film and what separates it from the bad ones. I'm Abin.
And I'm Rohit. Let's start the show.
I am big. It's the pictures that got small.
Yeah, okay. So we're doing this off the back of a film that was released in India called Durandar, which has gone on to become a box office smash hit. And even though it's not really a war film, it's kind of more of a mob infiltration kind of movie. It is being banded about as a war movie given the rather insane times we're currently living in. The film has kicked up quite a bit of discourse online, specifically with regards to its subject matter. And as a result, a lot of people have been facing backlash over their views on the film, specifically those who didn't like it. Rohit and I were having a quick conversation about how we'd like to tackle the subject and, really get into the weeds of what makes a good war film or what makes a war film in general. And we thought, hey, why don't we just do a bit of a deep dive on this genre that has existed way before we were even born.
Yeah, I mean a good 80 years before we were born. But yeah, I
Yeah.
get I get what you're saying. In
Mm.
fact, I would say war itself, the concept is one of the oldest human concepts to exist, right? From the time when people are, groups of people have banded together and have had to defend their resources from other groups of people, we've had war. And I'm sure
Yeah.
while it might be a recent phenomenon for movies, because movies itself is a little over a century old, but war stories and plays and musicals and dramas about war have been there from right from Greek tragedies to those in India to across the world. So it's a very cross-cultural phenomenon. In fact, now that I think about it, a lot of the parameters that we'll be judging these movies on, or we will be dissecting in terms of what makes a good war film or what makes a bad war film, I would actually take a step back and say what makes a good war story, right? Because these tropes and these themes have existed in these tales even before cinema existed, right? You take a good war play or a story that's passed on generations. You've always had the good ones have always been able to separate themselves from the bad ones on these parameters. So in that sense, while we are using the medium of cinema to talk about what makes a good war story, I would in fact go on to say this discussion is in many ways also beyond cinema, right? It's just that
Mhm.
cinema is how you and I sort of end up viewing the world. So that's our sort of window into this topic.
Also, besides what we see on screen, it's important that we understand the motivation behind the existence of this film, or specifically what the director had intended to convey by telling the story and the way they've chosen to tell this story. Some films have been known to instigate, specifically, one that comes to mind is D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, which in itself is a war film, a more race war kind of movie that instigated the idea that black people are evil and that the white Christian nationalists were the heroes that the country deserved. It had terrible repercussions, revitalizing the Ku Klux Klan, who were on their way down after nearly 40 years. And since there have been several bits of war films, or all, to be perfectly honest, propaganda films that have tried to drive up national sentiments in a bid to regain power of the country that the film is made in. So I think before we jump into what really constitutes a good war film, I think it is important that as a viewing audience, we are able to not fall into this trap that many before us and many after us will continue to do so, given just how sensitive a subject war is.
Yeah, and I'm honestly all said and done, history is still a very subjective thing, right? As much as we would like to pretend otherwise, the victors do decide what narrative is going to be, passed down in to future generations. It's always difficult to approach a lot of war films uh, completely objectively, but I definitely buy your point on if a movie feels like, you know, it could either be propagating bad stereotypes, or it could be defending actions which may not stand up to moral scrutiny. But
Hmm.
a lot of we're going to in fact call out a couple of movies in the course of our discussion for sort of lionizing or eulogizing what are indefensible actions, to be honest, right,
Yeah.
against innocent people. So it's always good to sort of take a more critical view when it comes to war movies. Sure, it's easy to get carried away by the spectacle, and we will talk about the importance of that as well as one of the things that makes a good war movie or breaks it. But it's important to keep your rational mind switched on at all times when watching a war film. But with that,
Hmm.
now let's get into. Uh, I think we have four or five of these parameters or these points, right, which are or these boxes that a good war movie has to tick, and they are essentially clear and distinct good and bad guys, or even the lack thereof, right? Sometimes ambiguity is used to deliver a message in and of itself. That's the first parameter. The second one, obviously, is more on the technical side, which is how realistic the war movie feels. What is the staging like? How authentic it is, both in terms of look and feel, as well as in terms of if it's based on actual events, how authentic it is to history. Third one is what is that clear, distinct takeaway or message that stays with you. And usually this is a lot more powerful when you deliver it through one specific human story over the larger spectacle, right? So in other words, we're talking about how does the movie use or how does the movie humanize one individual story and elevate that over the theater of war to deliver a strong message that sticks with you. And how does that benefit or harm the movie if they've not done it? That's the third point. And the last one, of course, is what is the message that the movie leaves you with? Is the movie distinctly anti-war, or like we said, are there more nefarious intentions under the surface where it's sort of trying to justify actions that were taken, or is trying to portray perpetrators in a positive light? What exactly is the message that the movie wants to leave you with, right? So these were the four broad points that we could think of. Obviously, there could be more, and if you feel so, we'd love to hear from you. But we are going to discuss each of these points and try and give a couple of examples for each point of movies that got it right and movies that didn't, and therefore why they either worked really well and are beloved to this day, or they fell flat on their face. Right. So that's essentially going to be the structure of the episode. But with that, Abin, do you want to take the first point?
So I think with regards to like a clear distinction between the good or the bad, or like let's say lack thereof, my I always look for, like, when it comes to a good war film, nuance. I am not a fan of war movies that paint a particular section of people as bad guys, or at least the people involved in the actual combat as bad guys for the most part, because they're inevitably taking orders from people above them who have certain rather selfish goals in mind. Like, I think a good example of this would be the Clint Eastwood doubleheader, Flags of Our Fathers and Letters from Iwo Jima, which I think Letters from Iwo Jima is somehow the more the better of the two films. I think Flags of Our Fathers plays pretty much like a standard American war history kind of movie. But the idea, like, and I think this is more to do with what was happening, the ground reality of what was happening was so different, because a lot of the Japanese infantry and the navy were brought, and just the army in general were brought up with this notion that they were going to be wiped out, and that it was us them against the world, and this they were the greatest nation. I love films where there isn't a clear good and bad guy, especially from like an infantry perspective. I think those are the movies that really make you think, and it plays into the messaging of, of what we're going to discuss when it comes to like the themes and the whole matter of anti-war.
I agree with you for the most part, except for one exception, which I will get to. But adding to your point on nuance, right? Just giving an example closer to home is the 2000 movie Mission Kashmir, directed by Vidhu Vinod Chopra. The movie is about a group of Kashmiri separatists, right? So these are not insurgents; they're not Pakistani insurgents in India. These are Indians living in Kashmir who want a separate Kashmir state. Their disenfranchisement with the Indian Republic, mistreatment they face, and therefore, it sort of tries to give a view of why youth in Kashmir is angry and agitated, but it also shows us how nefarious elements, effectively personified by Jackie Shroff, are also
Hmm.
preying on these sentiments to engender or to affect destructive activities, right? Like, I understand the separatist sentiment, whether I empathize with it as a separate thing, but
Hmm.
bombings and killings never really helped anyone, right?
Yeah.
So it shows how these possibly justifiably angry young people are preyed upon by people with bad intentions, and the sort of all around tragic consequences that it has. Again, it shows both sides. It talks about why this is bad for India as a republic, but also why this is happening, right? Why are these people angry the way they are? It shows that really well. I feel it wasn't appreciated for its time. A, because I think it was a little ahead of its time. People, like, war movies in India didn't have that sort of nuance at that point. I mean, looking at Border 2, they still don't.
Hmm.
And Kashmir is anyway a touchy topic, right?
Yeah.
You ask me Indian, it's a touchy topic. It's a very hard line to toe successfully, which is why it probably didn't make
Hmm.
the money that it should have. But it is, when you look at it, it's a very nuanced and um, mature film. Now, coming to the exception that I
Hmm.
want to talk about, right? The one scenario in historical matchup where collectively the industry has decided it's okay to have a clear good and bad guy is Nazis, right?
Yeah.
Uh, and even with Nazis, there probably is a movie or two out there where there's somebody telling the story of maybe a Wehrmacht soldier, which is the German army and
Hmm.
not the SS commandos and stuff, right?
Hmm.
But nobody in their right minds is going out there to justify, tell the story of, oh, this is the inner workings of the mind of an SS officer. Collectively, we've all decided, fuck them, right? We
Yeah.
want to see them get messed up in movies. Like, we don't want to see them lose comprehensive. And the best example of this, the best example of Nazi destruction porn and like wish fulfillment to the point that it sort of messes around with history is a movie that Abhin and I have talked about enough in the past. That is Inglorious Bastards, right?
100%.
Here, this is a movie where clear good and bad actually benefits the movie greatly, right? Your Nazis are populated with just the worst kind of fucking assholes, and your good guys a little over the top in an Aldoran or something, but again very distinct. It's black and white. There's no gray area, right? And you know that going in, and that's exactly what you want to watch the movie for.
I think
The
there's
one
only like
exception I
one
want to talk
guy.
about
Yeah,
is,
the one guy in the entire film that has some sort of like nuance to him. And you could say Frederick Zoller also has that bit of nuance. Frederick Zoller, which is Daniel Bruce's character, the guy who
yeah,
becomes a national hero, where he's like revisiting his thoughts on what he did. And of course, the Nazi general that they capture, who then gets beaten to death over the head by Eli Roth's the Bear Jew, and he asks him, you get that medal for killing Nazis." That is probably the only bit where you use a multifaceted version of these army generals or of the SS, but the rest is just well deserved good fun. Like fuck these guys.
yeah. But even with Frederick Zoller, it's like, oh, maybe he's the one good Nazi. Boom, incel. There you go.
Yeah, exactly.
So I just wanted to point that out and throw up the example of Inglorious Bastards. But a couple more examples on nuanced takes, right? Where there aren't distinct good or bad guys. In fact, I would say the protagonists of the movie are actually bad. Are you take your pick of any of the Vietnam War movies, right? You look at Apocalypse Now, you look at Platoon, you look at, like I said, take your pick. All of them talk about how it was such a, like, a bombastic, drastic, like, landmark mistake to have gone into Vietnam, and it's utterly misguided. The sort of the motivations for getting in, the actions that were taken, people lost their minds in the jungles of Vietnam. It's like, imagine you're sitting in your house, somebody breaks into your house, slips on water, hurts their head, like splits their head wide open, bleeds all over the place, hits you on the face, like whatever, punches you in the stomach and kicks you in the mouth for them having slipped and bled. It shows you the finger and walks out. You are like, why?
For those of you who don't know, why did the US get involved in the Vietnam War?
So the war in Vietnam was essentially a proxy war because there was a communist uprising, and the Communist Party came to power in the northern part of the country, which immediately the Russians started backing with money and weapons. And the US was like, hey, we can't have that. The idea was to reduce the spread of communism, and therefore the US started backing a South Vietnam based Democratic Party, if one were to call it, and effectively or essentially the US and Russia played out their proxy war, and the people who were affected because of this were primarily the people living in Vietnam. But over the years, also Cambodia and Laos were badly bombed because a lot of men and arms were moved through routes that went through this country. So there was carpet bombing that happened in Laos. In fact, I've been to Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. Cambodia, for various other reasons in their history, have had a lot of deaths, and they haven't recovered from it. Vietnam, for the most part, has, I would say, about more than recovered.
Hmm.
Are they have better infrastructure than us in India. So that's a whole other discussion for another day.
Conversation, yeah.
But Laos, for the most part, is still bombed out. Like when we flew over Laos, I was like, this country has not recovered from the Vietnam War still. The sort of collateral damage that happened. So, but anyways, that's besides the point. Coming back to what we were saying. Any Vietnam War, again, it's the lack of, or rather, the nuance that it has, and the lack of any attempt to show Americans in initially there were movies, right? In fact, John Wayne has starred in a couple of movies in the early 60s, which was attempting to show the US's decision to enter Vietnam in a positive light. But right off, like 2 3 years into the war, protests started and people were not having it. They were like, no, this is nonsense, right? This is out and out propaganda, right? I think
I
no,
think I think there was a bombing of a particular embassy which really shifted sentiment, because up until that point the media coverage was all about how the US was winning the Vietnamese War. I think the John Wayne movie you're talking about is the Green Berets, which came out in 1969. We'll
yes.
address it in the bad movies part of the section, because it very much came and tanked at the box office. It tried to portray the Vietnamese as bad people, and only think in the 80s, like starting when with Oliver Stone and with Full Metal Jacket to a certain degree, was when, and even Apocalypse Now, I think 1979, the horror is kind of where people started taking a different take. Like the media approach was more about how it had impacted soldiers in general. I think Born on the 4th of July also talks about this in detail, but we'll get to that later. The idea is that they flipped the narrative on the good versus the good and the bad guys, and I think a lot of those films weren't afraid to show that the American side of wasn't exactly the victors that were portrayed in the media for the last 20 years, and the psychological impact it had had on them while being there in North Vietnam, right? So
Yeah.
that, I think, is the first aspect of it. Let's move on to point number two, which is the realism, the staging, of the authenticity. Now, if you tend to rely on spectacle when it comes to war movies, you have to get it right. Otherwise, it looks cheap and it could look like, some of the several knockoffs we've been seeing in Bollywood for the last couple of years. But I think you, me, and the rest of the world agree that when it comes to realism and staging and really making you feel the visceral brutality of war, few films compare to 1998's Saving Private Ryan. Specifically, the first 20 minutes. We have addressed this on prior episodes. The storming of Normandy Beach on D Day is a sequence that has lived in our memories for the last 25 to 30 years. Holy shit, when it comes to really focusing on the brutality of war from a spectacle standpoint, I think Saving Private Ryan is up there as one of the best.
Yeah, it is definitely. Again, I think couple of trivia points of trivia that we may have mentioned earlier. When actual World War II veterans were taken to watch the movie, a bunch of them had a PTSD reaction upon watching this opening scene because it was that realistic, right? It sort of took them right back to their D-Day landings. And another sort of local funda for us Bangaloreans is that during the scene, Tom Hanks even asks for a bunch of Bangalores. And that's because there was a essentially a form of torpedo missiles. These long pipe bombs that the army used, which were manufactured and exported from Bangalore. Hence the name Bangalore's. In fact, it was the place of manufacture is close to where the Madras Sappers facility is today, right on Asai Road.
Yeah.
So again, close to
Hmm.
where we live. So
Exactly. Yeah.
little bit of trivia for us Bangaloreans. On an unrelated note, there's also the other movie equally interesting and engaging, which is Saving Ryan's Privates, right?
Of course.
And
Yes.
that has the storming of Normandy speech. Uh,
Oh God. Okay. I'm not getting into this. He's bad. This is not the subject for it. But staying with the theme, I think there's another one that really sticks to mind. The movie I don't quite enjoy, I must commend its set pieces and generally its scale, which is Dunkirk. Now, 2017's Dunkirk also tackles this almost. It's basically an island, right? Like the entire thing is an island is about to be bombed to shit, and they have to get the soldiers out of there as quickly as possible. So, in its the premise itself makes for like supremely exciting viewing, and I think the first 20 minutes of this, as the soldiers are running through the streets of Dunkirk, is quite a spectacle. You have the ground infantry, you have like the infantry on ground, on the beach, especially. You have people in a boat that is sinking. You've got like a RAF veteran pilot who's in a dogfight with another pilot. So there's a lot of things happening, and best viewed on one of the biggest IMAX screens you could possibly find. A movie I found emotionally cold, but at the same time, I respect for its clear spectacle. I think this is a movie that if you had to watch in a movie theater, it would be one of the top five films, especially when it comes to the war genre.
I absolutely agree. In fact, I had put down Dunkirk as an example of a bad film for the next point, right? Which is using humans to tell a story above the spectacle. And I feel that is something that Christopher Nolan lacks at in general. He really
Hmm.
struggles to give his characters a lot of depth across movies, right? It's very
Hmm.
super. It feels like a college grad's attempt at character depth. He's very good at set pieces. He's very good at engaging storylines, but his characters seem paper thin. And I mean, just a side note, that's exactly my biggest concern with the upcoming Odysseus, right? Because all said and done, Odysseus is, or what a upcoming Odyssey, because Odysseus is he's a deeply flawed character with very human motivations for his actions, right? He's not one of those textbook heroes where he does stuff for heroism's sake. I just
Hmm.
feel Nolan's going to focus on the spectacle of war and sort of sterilize the subject. It's going to be a great theatrical watch, but a sort of flat movie nonetheless. Of course, he's proven us wrong with Oppenheimer, so
Yeah.
I hope it's more Oppenheimer and less Dunkirk. But
Hmm.
but yeah, that's actually Oppenheimer is also an unexpected war movie, which actually does tell a human story over the spectacle. Now that I think about it, unexpectedly
It is
decent.
definitely a war film. I want to save that for the anti-war subject because the human story of a spectacle, which is our next
Yes.
point. But primarily, I think in terms of like like movies that focus on the scale aspect of it, I think these two come to mind. I am
Also
not a fan of.
1917.
Yeah, 1917 is my next. I think it's again for the next point. It can't be there because I think
I mean, but also technical. It's a I know it's a pseudo one shot, but it
yeah,
is shot brilliantly. The music is brilliant. Again, 1917 is a movie that falls, as an example for a good film across many of these points, as any good film should, right? It should tick a lot of these boxes. But for me, it came into in mind because this was one of those films that I went to the theater multiple times to watch. In fact, I think
yeah.
I saw it in theaters thrice, purely because of how much fun it was to watch that one take, uh, like sort of movie in cinemas. And Roger D. We've spoken about this, across multiple
But again,
episodes.
so I think we kind of need to like talk about it a little bit in detail because this is an episode. It's one of our earlier episodes we did on the audio podcast. I think Rohit and I have a shared love for 1917. He watched it three times in theaters. I watched it thrice in theaters as well. I remember it was like the December season, December January 2020, where just before the world went to shit. Right, I happened to stumble into an IMAX screen. I was in the US, and I'd heard about this like one shot. I thought from the trailers it looked like any other war film, and then I was told it was like it was a one shot or like a pseudo one shot war film, and I was immediately invested. I said, "Oh, I'd love to see how they've made this happen, and with 14-minute long takes." Like spectacles, gaffs that have been left into the movie. This was a movie that made me genuinely emotional because it follows two boys and two boys who are tasked with delivering news to a colonel who is about to basically send his men to their death, right? And this is one such incident that repeated over the course of the First World War. A war on which there aren't a lot of films. I think World War II, given the depravity of the Nazis, makes for a lot more engaging good versus bad storytelling, like harkening back to our earlier point, that very few people actually engage with the First World War, which, to be fair, was worse than the Second World War because, and we've addressed this on the 1917 episode, about how technology hadn't really caught up um, like it had during the Second World War. So this was a dirty war where humans were treated like meat grinders. I think there isn't a better representation of this than the Battle of the Somme, which is one of the most bloodiest wars to have ever, bloodiest battles to have ever taken place. It was really refreshing to see a movie that handled the subject matter with such delicate detail without sacrificing on the spectacle.
100%. I 100% agree. But yeah, that's on the second point that any good war movie should sort of score on, which is the technical side, no realism, authenticity. The third bit is what we've been alluding to, which is the ability to tell a human story amidst the spectacle and sort of elevate it above the spectacle, right? And this is probably the hardest of the four to get right, because
Hmm.
this is equally on the script, it is on the treatment, it is on the screenplay, it is on the direction. Everything has to land for this to work, right?
Okay.
Having clear good and bad guys could very much be a function of the source material or the writing. Getting your technicals right, sure, you get a good DP, you get a good production designer. A lot of those things can be sorted. This is where all your cylinders have to fire, right? Otherwise, your human story, if that falls short, it's very hard for the audience to sort of connect on a one-to-one basis with your film, which is
Yeah.
why we've seen so many that try various ways to get you to connect with their characters, and some succeed, but most of them fail, right? uh, and we can probably discuss a few that succeeded and a few that failed, but what are the ones that come to
Mhm.
mind for you, Abhay?
I think, see, even like we all talk about Saving Private Ryan for his spectacle, and it definitely is. But the idea is the reason they go to save this guy is very human. Like on one day, a mother loses three of her sons or two, I forget the actual number,
Three.
and three of her sons, and they get news that this guy's been captured behind enemy lines. So they set out to go retrieve him. Now this is like a suicide mission, right? The idea, but the story is more emotional, and that's what ultimately, like, makes us human. Like, the idea is you will put yourself in like stupid situations for emotional reasons, and I think Saving Private Ryan is one such film that comes to mind. And another example of this for me is the 80s classic Grave of the Fireflies. A movie, I mean, I guess it also falls into the anti-war discussion because the list of films on this for this episode can cascade through each point, like each topic that we're covering. But it is a film that focuses entirely on the human element as opposed to the war element. In fact, the only aspect of it where they briefly discuss the war element and the opening section, which is the Kobe bombings. For the longest time, I thought this was about the Kyoto bombing, the Kyoto fire, but it wasn't. This is about the Kobe bombings, and it is about a brother and sister whose father is the Japanese admiral in the Navy, and whose mother dies in the bombings, and is they're forced to go live with their aunt in a time where food is scarce, and they decide to go off on their own and basically how they become victims of a situation. I think war generally is tragic, and the cost of human life is already reduced from the meager like the meager value it already has attached to it. And Grave of the Fireflies is such a great film that I would recommend everybody watch once and never watch again, because it is that tragic and it really encapsulates just the cost of what people had to give up in order to keep the to keep this theater going.
Yeah, no, I agree. In fact, I would say it's in that set of movies, there's Grave of the Fireflies, there's Requiem for a Dream. Probably come and see another movie that is a great war film. These are all movies which you're like, you watch it, you're like, amazing, outstanding, never watching again.
Especially, I think, yeah, even Come and See for that matter. Come and See is most like, from what I know of Come and See, and of what I know, I'm saying what I've seen of Come and See. Come and See is the perfect example of what people's perception of war is like and what the actual reality of war is like.
Yeah,
So, in the story of Come and See, a young boy joins like a unit of Soviet soldiers in the Second World War, and
yeah,
it is essentially his descent into hell. Like, it, by the end of the film, the boy, who is like young and is basically a 14-year-old kid at this point, right? And he's got like a lot of joy and he wants to be part of these heroes, of people he perceives as heroes. But then what he ends up seeing: an entire village massacred, like a town of women and children thrown into a barn, with then and then being set on fire. Just like, much like River Fireflies, right? Like, the sheer disregard for human life and just how you're a pawn in such a bigger scheme. And I love how the movie ends. Like, I'm not to spoil Come and See, but at the end, where I forget the boy's name, the character, he's sitting in like he's sitting on this little sandbank, and he's just staring into the water, and his face is haggard, he's grown old, there are bags under his eyes. He has this thousand-yard stare. A thousand-yard stare is essentially what happened to a lot of a lot of soldiers who'd been in active combat for so long, where there was no such thing as PTSD, right? Especially in the First and the Second World War, it wasn't really something that had been diagnosed. So it is just them in their own heads. I think a great example, I think a real life example is some of the German soldiers who survived the Battle of Stalingrad. Now, the psychological aspect, I think there's a movie that details it, but I don't know. There have been maybe two movies on Stalingrad, which is by far the bloodiest battle of all time.
yeah. Probably in terms of total casualties, both sides combined, I wouldn't be surprised. And probably around 3 million casualties. So
Yeah. So,
quick Google search tells me it's closer to 2 million and not 3 million. But I
mm.
mean, when millions of people are dying, what's 2 million and 3 million?
And just, I think a lot of the Stalingrad vets, right? Given what, like, the Soviets had a directive from Stalin that said not one step back, and they constantly had a ticking of a clock playing through the streets of Stalingrad, and with messages saying something along the lines of uh, the only good German is a dead German. And a lot of people went crazy, ate horses, were eating belts, and all because Hitler decided that he wanted to like go capture the Hungarian oil fields on a whim.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of that extreme behavior was also in the siege of Leningrad, but
Hmm.
that's when Russians who were besieged in Leningrad ended up having to eat their belts, their dogs, their animals in the zoo and stuff. There was in Stalingrad, what had happened was when the Russian offensive started winning and the Germans were on the back foot, which was after about a year of fighting. The Russians had encircled the Germans, and the Germans were not able to be provisioned, and that was the winter of 1943. And then it was winter, there were no provisions, and that was when Germans got a taste of what the Russians at Leningrad were going through or had gone through,
Hmm.
right? Where no food, no shelter against the elements, and a lot of what you were saying happened. People died of frostbite, people sort of killed themselves, but Hitler refused to allow his general to surrender. And I think eventually the general went against Hitler's orders and just surrendered, saying, "I cannot watch my men just die because of some idiots who's sitting in Berlin comfortable and doesn't know what we are
I think
going through."
something
But
along the
anyway,
lines of
I
like
digress.
nobody, yeah, that is, yeah, we're going on just like book, like in that point. I think a lot of the German, when the German uh, The German generals were like, "Well, there's no point taking orders from a Bavarian corporal because that's what,
Yeah.
or a Bavarian private because that's what Hitler generally was." But I think we're kind of getting away from what we were trying to like. The point we are trying to make is the idea that films that best encapsulate the human spectacle, even Hacksaw Ridge, for which I really don't like the second half where it becomes this like this gore fest. The the story that it focuses on this medic who refused to like take part in the war and just save people is quite commendable and boosted by a great performance by Andrew Garfield.
Yes, I do want to talk about a very interesting example, very contrarian in many ways, but still won a lot of acclaim, which also talks about a very human story, but the most unexpected sort of human. I'm talking about Jonathan Glazer's Zone of Interest,
Of
which
course, yeah.
was about Adolf Eichmann, the guy who ran Auschwitz, was in charge of the Auschwitz concentration camp. It's a very bizarre film in that it chooses very much to focus on domestic strife and like the domestic happenings of Adolf Eichmann's house, which just so happens to be attached or adjacent to that Auschwitz camp. And the entire time, in fact, if you watch the movie, while people are having conversations in the house, in Eichmann's house, in the background, you can very faintly hear the screams and you can hear people crying. You can hear people being yelled at by guards. So it addresses the horrors of what happened in Auschwitz, but in such a tangential way, and it shows um, what Hannah Arendt, the sociologist, effectively called the banality of evil, right? And that's she coined that term specifically with regard to or with reference to Adolf Eichmann's attitude, where him and many others like him, when they were questioned, why did you put people through these sort of atrocities? He said, I was just following orders, right? And that's when Hannah Arendt came up with the term of banality of evil, where she says, for evil, I mean, the essence of that is for evil to happen, good people just need to stop asking questions and do nothing, right?
Adding on to that point, I think even like real life, what do you call real life incidents like the Nanjing massacre, where the Japanese basically stormed the city of Nanjing and then just proceeded to commit so many so many war crimes that even an actual Nazi who was living in the city wrote
Yeah.
to the German consulate saying this is a bit too much. And when
Yeah, John Rabe,
questioned,
his name was.
hmm, yeah,
John
and when
Rabe was like,
questioned
hey,
as
but I am a Nazi and this is pretty extreme.
and once the Japanese soldiers were asked why they did it, and they always would like this whole thing was drummed into them. And going back to the Iwo Jima point about how Japan was this one superior nation and everybody below them were just were like pigs. So they started to view humans or like other people from other races as pigs. So it was easier to separate or to like perform atrocities on them
Which
because
is
you
one
never
of the
really saw
first
them as
stages
people.
of genocide. Like, there's a lot of research that has gone into how genocide is propagated. Among the first steps that are taken is the dehumanization of the target group, right? It
Hmm.
happened with the Jews, it happened with Chinese, amongst Japanese, it has happened with the Rohingyas, it has happened with countless people. Wherever you have target groups that have been subjected to atrocities, one of the first things that perpetrators do is dehumanize them. It happened in
Hmm.
Rwanda, where the Hutus were told, kill the Tutsi cockroaches, right? The Tutsis were equated to
Yeah.
cockroaches. Start
Hmm.
dehumanizing them. You'll see examples abound of this, but anyway, again, we digress. But coming back to the point, Zone of Interest was a movie I wanted to call out because it instinctively goes against a lot of these points, but it still turns out to be a great movie that I would recommend everyone to watch, right? But yeah, I think that brings us to the last point, which is
I
what
have
is the
one
message of
film to
the movie?
add to this
Uh,
list.
but
I
go
have
for it.
one large film to add to this list, and it's a very different kind of war film. Right? I think it's more of a comedy, but then it does address the human spectacle more, and that is Jojo Rabbit. Now,
Yes.
Jojo Rabbit is one of my favorite films. I think this is Taika Waititi. It's again based on a book called Iron Skies, and it's about this guy whose imaginary best friend is Hitler. And one day he finds a Jewish girl hiding in his home, and his mother is one of the leading members of the, of the resistance. And they portray the Nazis as like as jokers, but then the film is also very real about the cost of human life, as we've been discussing. And there is one scene in this movie which I think all of us, like, I'm just thinking about it, I'm getting goosebumps, which plays to mind, and it involves around a pair of shoes, where the movie stops just being a, like, for a while you're like, okay, this is a very hilarious take on like the Second World War, but then it also addresses the true horrors. And I don't think a scene like that has stayed with me for such a long time. I mean, I've watched Schindler's List. It's a movie I'll never watch again. Again, Schindler's List puts the human spectacle over the actual war, the war effort, the storming of the Krakow ghetto, generally the Auschwitz, the naked run through the Auschwitz camp. It really highlights one of the worst aspects of the Second World War. What it took to get a lot of them, even though there might be a fair amount of puffery, I think from real life history, Oscar Schindler wasn't exactly as benevolent as he's been made to be. But from a storytelling perspective, I think this is, I mean, he clearly did save the lives of 1,000 Jews. But yeah, Jojo is a film that I wanted to quickly talk about, how a movie that truly focuses on the human side of the war.
Absolutely, absolutely. Um, I totally agree. But yeah, that brings us to the last point, which is what is the underlying motivation of the film, the filmmaker, and what is the message that they want us to take away. I think it is a fairly non-controversial statement to say war is bad, and therefore
Yes.
a good message for a war film should be that should show the futility of war and why it is probably good to not go war with people unless it's very objectively certain that the people you're, which again, I mean, like I said, history and narratives are very subjective, right? Who's to say who's right and who's wrong? It's it's complicated, but at the very least a good war film should not go out and say, yeah, we did this and it was awesome, so what, right? Like, that's any movie that tries to sort of land that message is something that you should look at with questionable eyes, right? Like, what are they trying to say? um I think I'm going to come out and say it. The biggest culprit or the most repeat offender when it comes to the latter kind of treatment is, again, like Vietnam, the other opposite. Take your pick of movies set in the Middle East,
Hmm.
uh, of the last 2 decades, right? More often than not, these movies talk about how Americans went in and delivered freedom, and they were under great duress and they had to undergo such peril, and heroes are forged in the cauldron of uh, Iraq and Afghanistan. And I can, to an extent, while not really, but I can sort of get the justification of going into Afghanistan because you thought you were chasing Osama bin Laden, and 9/11 is objectively a shitty thing that happened. So sure. But the whole Iraq thing, I'm like, bro, what are you trying to justify? Fuck you, right? Just fuck you.
Iraq, I think I want to get to it, and I will. I just want to quickly address the anti-war section of this, and I think every good war film, like you addressed, is has to be an anti-war film. I think if you come out of a film, either want to hug somebody or like question humanity, the movie kind of has done its job. Looking at some of the greatest examples of this would probably include, like we mentioned, Grave of the Fireflies. All Quiet on the Western Front is another great example. Paths of Glory, I think Full Metal Jacket, Stanley Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket, on the impact of generally the army on the lives of soldiers. Similarly, 1917 itself is another great anti-war film. Come and see example, great anti-war film. Grave of the Fireflies, in my opinion, is probably the gold standard when it comes to anti-war films. So I think there's a lot of great films that have existed. Even Apocalypse Now, Yeah, I mean, it's about people who went crazy. Then you have the Robert De Niro film, which is what is it called?
Deer
Oh my
Hunter.
God, Deer Hunter is also an anti-war film. I think generally between the 80s and the 90s was there was a fair amount of films that said, "Hey, that were coming off the back, they'd seen the impact of the Vietnam War and said, "Hey, this is a bad thing. This shouldn't happen again." And now I think it's a good time to flip the narrative into some of the bad representations of this. Let's go from back to front, like from 5-1 or 4-1, like we did. And piggybacking onto your point about the Middle East, there was a lot of films that depicted brown people, specifically Arabs, as the bad guys, so much so that every time movies that, like, every time people were praying, Allah Akbar is generally a term reserved for, like, it is something that became associated with, had negative connotations, when in fact was used as by extremists and terrorists for certain situations. But because of its constant portrayal in media, it had
Yeah,
become
yeah,
almost like this.
effectively, it's gotten
Yeah,
associated with detonations instead of intonations to prayer, right? Like,
exactly, right. Yeah, so that, and then even films that detail the capture um, of Osama bin Laden, like Zero Dark 30. Zero Dark 30 highlights, for me, is a great watch as a movie, but like some of it highlights some of the horrors of what the US was doing in the likes of
yeah,
Abu Ghraib in
Zero
terms
Dark
of
30's message is waterboarding is good. It's what is Osama bin Laden. Do not question the CIA.
No, and I was just like, oh, Zero Dark 30 was a hard watch. Similarly with Homeland, and Body of Lies is another one that comes to mind. Body of Lies is more again an infiltration film, not
American
exactly
Sniper.
fun watch.
Who is that?
American
Kyle,
Sniper, I
whatever the
think, is the
fuck.
most, yeah, egregious example of this. Is a dude who went and shot kids, and he's like, "Oh, I'm feeling bad," Mm, uh,
Yeah, bro,
which
you're feeling bad. You can feel stuff. They're dead. So
yeah, it's just one of those movies that, for me, I think did a lot of whitewashing when it came to like addressing the you know the pain of a huge section of the Middle East. Like, what really upset me, and I think, see, I am not going to sit here and act like Saddam Hussein was a good guy. He was not a good guy. His children were somehow even worse, and I think by removing him from the Middle East, the US did their job, but they were there a lot longer. And
no, and
every single
also
time,
Saddam
yeah.
Hussein, his evil was self-contained more or less within Iraq. He wasn't going around and doing only anywhere and everywhere, right? These people just came and like put a grenade in. It's like, putting a wolf among chickens. And the worst part of the hypocrisy is to come back and say, "Oh, I understand the individuals who went to war, right? You didn't decide to go. Your government did, and you went there. You got fucked up, and you have PTSD. I don't give a shit. It's not about you. The people who were invaded are the victims, not you. When there are videos of American soldiers having randomly shot at people at night, for fun they would just shoot at the hillside and see if they killed people on infrared and whatnot, right? So yeah, you have PTSD. uh, Too bad. You are still not the victim. The worst perpetrator might be the government, but you don't get to turn around and cry wolf, or tell a sob story when people who these injustices were perpetrated on, but then subsequently subjected to ISIS, subsequently subjected to the Iraqi army and their own atrocities. I'm like, please, there is no comparison to what they went through and what you did, right? So don't even bother justifying it. But anyway, movies that tend to do that in my book are straight zero, like straight trash, and I'm not giving them the time of day. So I think that those are the bad anti-war movies, or probably pro-war movies, right? I've already mentioned Dunkirk, which for me is an example of a movie that fails to tell a human story engagingly enough and sort of gets overridden by the spectacle. But are there any movies that you want to talk about in that vein?
Where it's just, I think, I think for me, I think the ones that stick to mind are Hacksaw Ridge and the 100 other like Indian Bollywood knockoffs of these films that have come out over the last couple of years. A lot of the films that are extremely jingoistic in their perspective, that don't really tell any story, but are almost like, as I liked a term I coined while watching Durandar was to titty twist the audience into feeling a certain way, where the story is like irrelevant. It's like it's basically manipulative as shit, right? Which also I think holds well for like the good and the bad aspect. I think it probably fits in there a little better. But from this perspective, I think movies like 13 Hours of Benghazi, which is a movie I didn't enjoy. Everyone said it is amazing. I just did not enjoy it. The Border Twos of the world, or just primarily culprit, like is again reiterating this point, is Hacksaw Ridge, where I think the first and the second half seem so disconnected that you're just like, ugh, this movie is just, it's just gore porn, and it's a Mel Gibson problem.
Yeah. No, I agree. I agree. I think those are good examples of bad movies on that count. Thinking of bad technical movies, it's hard to really. Most war movies get this right. Like these are table stakes, right? If you're not able to get your technicals right in a war movie, what business do you have making one? I'm really actually struggling to think of, are there any bad war
Pearl
movies
Harbor.
with bad CGI? I mean, for its
Pearl
time,
Harbor.
I guess. I
But
guess.
Pearl Harbor, there's this like, it's a 40s film, but it has 60s aircrafts in it. So it's just like, they're like, fuck,
Okay, yeah,
historical
authenticity,
accuracy.
yes, authentic, yeah, oh yeah,
Hmm.
on that point, yeah, 100%,
Hmm.
100%. Again,
It's just,
foolish of us to expect authenticity in a Michael Bay film, but even for a war film, yeah, you're absolutely right. That is, he doesn't give a rat's ass about authenticity.
it's cliched, it's hollow, it has like, it is.
What's the Roger Ebert? What's the Roger Ebert review? He says Michael Bay has shown us how how what the Second World War inconvenienced this love triangle between Kate Beckinsale, Ben Affleck, and I was like, dude,
There's,
that's as good as a way as I could put it.
isn't there a line, isn't this the movie where there's a line where someone turns to the camera and goes, I think World War II just started? Isn't this
Prob-
that movie?
Probably, I wouldn't be
I was
surprised.
like, bro, yeah, it is a film that just, it's bad. It is really bad. I think some of
That's really
like
bad.
Indian ones also. There was a movie called, like, there are a bunch of 2000s movies like Major Saab and some like films that were LOC. I think the follow up to Borders, LOC also was a really bad film.
Then what was that
In
love
the
story
Indian
of a
subcontinent.
spy, a Sunny Deol film?
Hero. Yeah, but that was a huge
Hero
hit,
love
dude.
story. It
Mm,
was. Doesn't make it a good film.
mm. That's not. I mean, I don't think it was. It was a huge ass hit here.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think now coming back to the one of the first, like the films that kind of like essentially painted good guys like as and bad guys. I, like I think this is the perfect time to discuss Durandar for a little bit, which is a movie that for me, again, for those of you who don't know, Durandar is a 2025 film that details the infiltration of the details a spy infiltrating the Pakistani mob bosses who are trying to destabilize India through various terrorist networks. It kind of is like Forrest Gump with the Kalishnikov is what Siddharth Adlakha had said for his IGN review. It's this guy tracing a bloodied history of India from the early late 90s to the early 2000s. Historically, all over the place, like doesn't require like there are people have poked enough holes in the accuracy aspect of it. As a film, it clicks, it runs on all cylinders, but it also does this thing that a lot of movies do, is that it decides to paint one section of society, or rather one section of society based on the religion, as the bad guys, perpetually catering, rather adding on to the last point we made about how bad the Middle Eastern American films were, and how and what damage it did to a society. I think these are another section of movies that did the same thing as well. I think Durandar didn't need it, which is my whole thing. I think as a film without this jingoistic ass side that it has that pops up in various parts of the films, it works perfectly well and is a good time. Like, I don't need to be sitting in the theater and being told what new India is. I know what India is. I live in India. So you live in India. We are well aware of the ground reality of the situation. It has no correlation to the rest of the story you're telling, and I found that to be quite unnecessary.
No, no, I'm just saying, at the whole time when you were talking about that, I was like, hey, mob infiltration and all good, New India good. What about air quality, roads?
Yeah.
Can we have those first? Like,
Yeah, please. Yeah, okay, let's
and
start
like
there, right?
the most egregious line to me is when he says, Madhavan's character says, we will wait for a man or a government that will want to do something about it. I'm like, do something about this first. Infra is shit. Joblessness is going up. You're coming up in Epstein files, dancing in front of Trump. Do something about these things first.
Oh man. I think another, like from a global perspective, much like Durandar and a lot of the jingoistic shit that had happened, I think there are sequels that completely like forego the nuance of the first. Like you look at Rambo First Blood, which is such a different movie, and then Rambo 2 comes along and it becomes a whole other thing. Like I don't know if you remember Rambo 2.
Yeah, yeah. Rambo is about how a post Vietnam soldier is struggling with PTSD and lashing out. Rambo 2 is about muscle, Sylvester Stallone, muscle.
Yeah, that's so basically Nuance goes out the bloody window and he's like, I'm just gonna kill everybody. And then
Yeah.
Rambo 4 also he's like killing Vietnamese people. Vietnamese allow Cambodian people. I'm not quite sure where he is.
I'm sure it didn't make a difference to them. So,
Yeah, it's just that there are movies that again that they're like, okay, good guy, bad guy, good guys like fuck yeah America or like fuck yeah India, fuck these guys, and you start to shoot people. I think that's when you start to paint them into caricatures of themselves or like basically cartoonish villains of themselves. Is that's when you have a problem. Again, once again, we're going back to the exception being Inglourious Bastards because the Nazis in this movie are cartoonish as hell, but the storytelling vehicle is fucking phenomenal. So I think from it insulates itself from being portrayed as like a film that would otherwise be silly. I mean, it is silly, but silly in a good way. And at the same time, there's a lot of emotional depth to the characters, which a lot of these movies lack.
yeah. So I think to sum it up, I would say whenever the next time you go to a theater to watch a war film or wherever you watch a war film, try to sort of evaluate them on these points and sort of critically view them on these parameters, and hopefully at the other end of it you'll come out with a much more objective view and not being swayed by the wrong ideas, but sort of taking the right message from it, the right learning from it, and hopefully have a more enriching viewing experience.
Yeah, I think it's important that when you get into a war film, you understand who really suffers in war. I think
Yeah.
Oppenheimer, I think James Cameron's gripe with Oppenheimer is something I start to like. And rather like when I first heard the fact that he was upset, it didn't really show the plight of how bad the Japanese felt and how what it did to Oppenheimer. I think it could have been something that the film, as much as it shows like Oppenheimer envisioning people just melting away in that in that courtroom, um, it's something that real people died. Like there's a if you read about what happened in Hiroshima, what happened in Nagasaki, like no amount of human guilt will ever justify what was lost, right?
I
So I
agree.
think it's best you understand like the idea is a good war film is one that makes you feel bad for this even happening in the first place. Like it makes you feel bad for the people involved. It makes you really question why things are happening and why they're happening the way they are.
Yeah.
And almost inevitably, it is for one person's greed.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. But yeah, I think that's it from us for this week.
You should let us know what are some of your favorite war films. What are some of the war films you hate to watch? What are some of the war films that are so bad that are good? It would be we'll just we could do like a deep dive on one of them going forward in the next couple of weeks. But yes, the pod is back. It has been a while. We were on a bit of a break, so going forward, you should see us more regularly on all your socials and on all platforms that you listen to. If you've gotten this far, please do like the video and share it with your friends, and also subscribe to the channel if you haven't. It really helps. We're trying to get to about 500 subscribers this year. We're on, I think, 180 or something. If we can get to 500, it would be amazing. It would help it would really ease my whole editing process. So Yeah, that's us. We'll be back again next week. We will decide what we have to talk about. And until then, you guys take care and we'll see you soon.
Bye bye.